Okay, now we're online.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our TLTS research seminars. We have taken a summer break. And to return to our seminar series today, we are so excited. We are so excited to have Dr. Nelson Flores from University of Pennsylvania. And Nelson is an old friend, and I have been watching Nelson for a long time, and I always talk to my students. I say, you guys, you girls, you need to learn from Nelson. You might be a fresh emergent scholar, but learn from these really dynamic, energetic scholars who is making great contribution to our field. So you can look at the bio of Nelson, but I just want to say Nelson is the king of tweets, okay? Nelson has so many followers, both in academia and beyond academia. And Nelson is so good in translating academic knowledge and ideas in a language that can reach out to everybody in society, including the layman, including those who are not familiar with applied linguistics, racial linguistics. So I'm saying to my students, we all need to learn from Nelson, being so grounded in theoretical research, but also so much in touch with society. So today we will have Nelson to first make a brief presentation of based on his latest paper, which is very interesting. And then we will have our doctoral student host to interact with Nelson. So over to you, Nelson.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I'm just getting set up here. And so I appreciate the comments about me being able to speak to a more general audience, but I will warn you in advance that this presentation is based on an article that is for an audience of people who have thought really deeply about issues of language and race. And so I warn you with that ahead of time. But this is based on a manuscript that should be coming out probably any day now that I co-authored with my friend and colleague Jonathan Rosa, who I've written several things with already. And in many ways, I think is a sequel to the Undoing Appropriateness article, which was our first collaboration with one another. It's kind of undoing appropriateness 2.0 by really thinking about competence as something that we also need to more critically interrogate. And so in that article, we start with an excerpt from a book that's actually not a book written by a linguist. It's written by an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, called Progressive Dystopia, which is about a predominantly Black and Latinx school in San Francisco. And in one of the chapters, she looks at a Spanish world language classroom, which is predominantly African-American students. And she analyzes a question that was raised by one of the African-American students in the class. The student asks the teacher, why can't we learn African? And Shange has this response to the question, which she takes as a serious critical interrogation, right? And her argument is we can't learn African because it don't exist. The 2,500 continental languages are distinct cultural and social units. Any of these 2,500 languages could have been spoken by one or more of our ancestors. So just as we have a claim to all of them, we have a claim to none. African is exactly what Black people in the Americas would have to learn if we were to have heritage language class. And so she uses this question as a point of entry for critically interrogating the dominant conceptions of language, culture, and heritage that permeate world language education and the field of applied linguistics and anthropology. And really thinks through the ways that these dominant conceptions of language, culture, and heritage are fundamentally anti-Black, in that they cannot account for and capture the experiences of Black people in the diaspora that has been created through the transatlantic slave trade. And so we use this example as a point of entry for beginning to kind of continue to further develop the argument that she's developing here about really thinking about the ways that dominant conceptions of language, culture, heritage are fundamentally anti-Black, are fundamentally kind of perpetuating colonial logics, including within applied linguistics. And so we do this by critically thinking through the notion of competence, which is, of course, invoked across a range of institutional domains in conjunction with assessment of people's capacity for educational achievement, for workplace effectiveness, kind of general functioning within the society. It's impossible to interact in the world without encountering discourses of competence and incompetence. And when we think about these discourses of competence and incompetence, we can see the ways that they've been used historically and in the present to frame racialized communities as deficient in ways that then justify their containment, remediation, and disposability. So if we think back to the Shanghai example, she's looking at the ways that discourses of competence and what it means to speak language and what it means to be competent in classrooms are used to justify the containment, remediation, and disposability of Black students in a San Francisco school, right? And competence is integral to it's an integral component to modernist conceptions of language learning that undergird many approaches in applied linguistics. So what do we mean by undoing competence? So we're not engaging in debates about whether people should use the term competence or replace it with a more seemingly positive term, right? And I think there sometimes is an instinct to do that when someone critiques a term. People say, can we develop a more asset-based way of thinking about that thing? And that's not actually what we're trying to do here. We're not saying that we should replace competence with another term that's more positive. Instead, we're interested in critically interrogating the onto-epistemological assumptions of the very notion of competence, right? And so we're interested in denaturalizing the universalizing narratives that undergird the conceptualization of competence, right? By pointing specifically to its locus of enunciation, meaning by pointing specifically to the specific geopolitical origins of this particular way of understanding humanity, right? And showing that this is not universal, this is not objective, this emerged within a specific socio-historical context within the context of European colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and imperialism, right? And we're also not suggesting that if you use the term competence, you're a racist, right? That's not the level that we're working at here. We're not working at the level of individuals. I don't know if you're a racist or not. That's not my interest, is whether you're racist or not. Instead, what our interest is are the histories that we inherit when we use particular frameworks, right? And if those histories are fundamentally colonial and we're not critically interrogating that in our use of these frameworks, then yes, we are perpetuating colonial logics, whether we ourselves consider ourselves to be racist or not, right? And so these are discourses that are circulating within applied linguistics, right? You really can't be in applied linguistics without encountering the term competence, right? And our argument is that this discourse of competence may actually reinscribe inequities that oftentimes applied linguists would like to think that they are actually working to challenge, right? And so to do this, we adopt an onto-epistemological view of race. And so what the heck does that mean, right? And so we're primarily building on the work of Sylvia Winter here, although we're building on the work of others in the article that you can see if you have the article. But essentially, an onto-epistemological view of race understands race to be about categorizing individuals according to their level of similarity or proximity to a genre of the human that has been overrepresented as white. So think genre, right? You think genre, you think a particular kind of way of producing knowledge or articulating knowledge or presenting knowledge. So if we think of human as a genre, that means there isn't a universalizing ideal of what it means to be human. There are specific ways that people understand human that emerge from specific socio-historical contexts, right? And when we say, building on the work of Winter, that the genre of the human has been overrepresented as white, we're not talking solely about overrepresentation as we're talking about overrepresentation as extending far beyond typical demographic connotations, right? More than just who's included, who's at the table, but towards the very logics that organize dominant societal institutions and value systems, right? And so when we say the genre of the human is overrepresented as white, what we mean is that it's universalizing a very specific notion of what it means to be human that emerged within violent colonial and imperialist histories and is treating that as what it means to be human, right? And so this kind of capacity, this helps to explain the capacity to articulate the rights of man as universal, ideals, which is kind of at the core of liberal humanism, right? This ideal that all men are created equal, right? So it helps us to understand how a framework could argue that all men are created equal while simultaneously engaging in violence against much of humanity. Because through this framework of overrepresenting the human as white, most of the world's population are not fully human or are subhuman, right? And so if you're not fully human or you're subhuman, then violence against you can be justified in the name of humanity, right? In the name of protecting humanity. And so if we accept the premise that liberal humanism is fundamentally anchored in colonial and imperialist violence, right? Then this causes a dilemma for applied linguists, right? Because if racialized individuals are only allowed access to applied linguistics through efforts that adhere to the liberal humanist project, then their inclusion will maintain the marginalization of their knowledges and communities, right? That the only way for them to become recognizable as legitimate applied linguists is to disavow the knowledge of their communities and to try to approximate this genre of the human that's been overrepresented as white, even though their racialized status prevents them from ever actually being able to adhere to that ideal. So that's a problem, right? And so we're interested as scholars who kind of developed the framework of racial-linguistic ideologies for thinking about the implications of this onto-epistemological view on racial-linguistic ideologies, right? So thinking about the linguistic components to the construction of race. And so from our perspective, the overrepresentation of the human as white co-articulates with the presupposition of homogeneous codes as the norm in human communication. And so from this perspective, whiteness becomes the perceived ability to engage in homogeneous codes with any perceived boundary crossing overrepresented as legitimate. And so the idea is that whiteness bestows on it this kind of ideological construction of I use a homogeneous code to communicate, thus I am a legitimate communicator. And if I'm switching between codes, the switching that I'm doing is a legitimate switch. It's a legitimate cross between boundaries, right? And we can see this kind of whiteness in as the foundation to formal linguistics, to theoretical linguistics, right? Where Noam Chomsky kind of tries to abstract the, quote, science of language into an ideal speaker-listener in a homogeneous speech community who knows its language perfectly, in contrast, to the linguistic problems of interesting diversity that are positioned as oftentimes outside of the scope of the science of language, right? And so we have this ideal speaker-hearer that's treated as this universal abstraction that actually stems from a situated racial-linguistic worldview that produced homogeneous codes as the norm of human communication, right? So you can only believe that an ideal speaker-hearer in homogeneous speech community is even appropriate as a theoretical abstraction if you believe that homogeneous codes are somehow the norm of human communication, and that issues of difference are things that are outside of the scope of linguistics. So this precludes the possibility of critically interrogating ideologically produced perceptions of homogeneity and heterogeneity, right? So you can't ask questions about racial hierarchies because that's not linguistics, right? And I'm sure any of us who studies race have come across formal linguists who say that what we do is not linguistics. And the only reason they can say that is because they're coming from a particular racial linguistic worldview that they've overrepresented as just what it means to be human, right? So they've adopted a fundamentally colonial worldview that overrepresents the genre of the human as white. And then they say anyone who doesn't do this is not a linguist, i.e. not fully human in the same way that we are, right? And so racialization then becomes anxieties about possible contamination of homogeneous codes through the overrepresentation of heterogeneity, right? So whiteness, homogeneous, all good. Racialization, hybridity, heterogeneity, contamination, right? Now, formal linguistics says none of that matters, right? Because linguists shouldn't be studying that at all. And I've already hopefully made the argument as to why that's a problem, right? So that's a problem. But sociolinguists, however, have said that we should be paying attention to these things, right? And so we spend the bulk of our paper not offering a critique of formal theoretical linguistics because that's kind of low-hanging fruit for those of us who study issues of power and race. Formal linguistics is designed not to study these issues. And so by definition, any effort to study it is a critique of formal linguistics, right? But sociolinguistics has prided itself on precisely paying attention to these issues as a response to formal linguistics, right? And so our argument, though, is that sociolinguistics actually doesn't really get to the root of the issue and actually continues to reinscribe these connection between whiteness as homogeneous and racialization as heterogeneous. And so we do this by thinking through communicative competence, right? Communicative competence as being still foundational to many approaches in applied linguistics, to many approaches to language teaching. And so communicative competence emerged as a response to Chomsky's, as sociolinguists began to argue for a science of language that presumes upon heterogeneity rather than homogeneity in the way that Chomsky was suggesting that linguistics needs to do. And so this move away from linguistic competence as ideal, perfect, and homogeneous towards communicative competence as embracing pluralism and diversity is oftentimes discussed as a progressive move in the field of applied linguistics. The argument that we make in this manuscript is that it continues to fail to locate its own framework within the same genre of the human that has been overrepresented as white, thereby reifying rather than challenging colonial logics in the ways that many of its proponents perhaps would like to think that they're doing. Okay, so how do I make this argument? So we make this argument by looking very closely at the origins of the term communicative competence, because we all know probably that I like to do genealogical work. I like to understand the histories of discourse across time, right? And so one of the ways to do that is to say, well, where does this term come from? What was the context that produced this term and this concept? And so Delheims, who we also know sexually harassed many women in the field, right, and push them out of the field. And so we already know that there are problems with him as an individual that the field has started to grapple with. What we're suggesting is that there are also problems with his theories that the field also needs to grapple with in ways that it hasn't yet. And so the idea of communicative competence actually emerged first in a conference in the United States on, quote, disadvantaged children, which is a term that isn't used commonly anymore. They use other euphemisms now, but it was a term that was very common in the 1960s in the United States, social science research, where the discourse emerged, right? And it was coming from this idea of the culture of poverty. The idea behind the culture of poverty was that generations of poverty had produced cultural and linguistic pathologies within racialized communities that needed to be fixed in order for them to achieve social mobility. So there's a lot happening in the United States in the 1960s, and there's a lot happening geopolitically around the world in the 1960s, right? There's a lot of political upheaval, right? There are lots of colonized peoples, third world peoples is what they were called at the time, right? Who were rising up against colonial rule. And in the United States, that came through the form of the civil rights movement that was often done in solidarity with struggles around the world. Now, that was a threat to a genre of the human overrepresented as white. And so one way of addressing that was to say, okay, racism is bad, but why is it bad? Because it creates cultural pathologies within racialized communities that needs to be fixed, right? So it's not bad because white people benefit from it, right? It's not bad that white people continue to benefit from it. It's bad because it creates deficiencies within racialized communities that social science researchers are going to study systematically and scientifically and develop strategies for fixing, right? So I think it's just important to just stop there for a second to understand that's the discourse that produces communicative competence, right? So if we find that discourse abhorrent, which I'm hoping many of us do, we have to sit with the fact that that's the discourse that produced communicative competence, right? A very specific US perspective and a very specific racialized perspective. And then it becomes universalized, right, in ways that I think are a problem. But so in onto-epistemological terms, essentially what's happening with this culture of poverty that produces this discourse of communicative competence is that it reproduced a governing genre of the human overrepresented as white, right? With the assumption being that the only way for racialized communities, both in the US and around the world, to achieve social progress was through efforts to emulate whiteness, despite the fact that their racialized status ontologically prevented them from fully inhabiting this white subject position, right? And so the culture of poverty is just a reconfiguration of colonial logics and done in a way that make it seem scientific, make it seem objective, but is universalizing of particular racial-linguistic worldview, right? That's overrepresented as white and colonial and anti-Black and all of these other things. And so I put all of that broader context when we look at the actual manuscript. So in the article, we look at two versions of it. There's the conference paper that was written in 62, and then there's the widely cited 72 piece that I think most people probably have read. But the question that's there in the conference paper, and I think is also there in the 72 piece, is how can we explain the disconnect between Chomskyan innateness of linguistic competence and the fact that, quote, disadvantaged children do not do well on assessments of verbal ability, right? And so this is the question that Himes is trying to answer when he first proposes the concept of communicative competence. So if we still think this is a valid question, then okay, if we think this question is problematic in a range of different ways, then we need to think about what we're doing, right? And so what his framing of it is that what he suggests in agreement with Chomsky is that while all people have the innate ability to learn language, right, which is a Chomskyan framework, communicative competence is what differed among speech communities. And so for him, the goal of sociolinguists interested in improving educational outcomes for disadvantaged children was to treat this as an empirical problem, right? as to document the speech habits or competencies of a community or population, right? So for him, explicitly, this is a quote empirical question. For Jonathan and I, this is immensely ideological, right? This is not an empirical question. This is an ideological positioning that has become universalized such that it could be treated as an empirical question. But you can't just call into question people's verbal abilities and treat that as, I mean, you can because people do it, right? But we're saying you can't do that and get away with that and thus not call that out. But okay. And so let's think through homogeneity and heterogeneity in relation to how communicative competence is talked about, right? And so Himes argues for a science of language that adopts heterogeneity of language as its central focus, right? And so he argues that sociolinguistics has to treat heterogeneity of speech communities and the priority of social relations as paramount. So you might say, okay, this solves the problem, right? This solves the problem of treating homogeneity as the norm of human communication, but it actually doesn't, because homogeneity still lies at the core of the framework that he's using. So he's building on the framework of verbal repertoire, right, which is from Gumpert's. I told you this will be technical, right? So we're looking at really like technical debates in the field, this in the 1960s that are the foundation for sociolinguistics, right? And so Gompertz defines a speech community as any human aggregate characterized by regular and frequent interaction by means of a shared body of verbal signs, yada, 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 right? And so actually, when we look at the definition of speech community, by definition, it is homogeneous, right? There is heterogeneity within the speech community, which I'm going to get to on the next slide, right? But by definition, the speech community itself is homogeneous, and its verbal repertoire is based on finite sets of grammatical rules that underline the production of well-formed sentences, right? And so there's an underlying assumption that what defines a speech community is homogeneity. It's a homogeneity of grammatical rules that underline well-formed sentences within that community, right? And so Himes is building on this framework of speech community and verbal repertoire in his discussion of communicative competence. And so where does heterogeneity come in? It comes in differences within the speech community, right? So heterogeneity is the differences that exist within a speech community, rather than kind of, so the homogeneity is the boundaries that define a speech community. And then within that speech community, there are heterogeneity of who has complete or full mastery of that repertoire. And so who doesn't have full mastery of that verbal repertoire? Well, according to Gumpertz, housewives don't, farmers don't, laborers don't, because they rarely meet outsiders, right? So they have less need for verbal facility and often make do with only a narrow range of speech styles. Again, framed as an objective description, which I'm hoping many of us see as ideological. And so the heterogeneity is that housewives have less verbal facility than the businessmen that are going out and talking to other people, right? Which of course has no basis in what housewives actually do, right? Which is engage in a whole bunch of different ways of using language that are specific to the communities in which they inhabit, like everyone, right? And so Himes builds on this idea that certain members of a community may have more fully developed verbal facility in the verbal repertoire than others to describe and revisit the case of White Thunder, who is someone that's become like a textbook classic example in most kind of linguistics classes. So White Thunder language practices were first described by Leonard Bloomfield, who was a prominent American linguist, right? I think in the 1930s or kind of in that time. And Bloomfield described White Thunder as lacking full proficiency in either English or Menominee, which was his native language, right? Which is the native language of his community. And so Himes revisits this discussion of White Thunder, and in comparison to Red Cloud, who was another member of this community that's described by Bloomfield as having more sophisticated understandings of how to use both English and Menominee, right? And so we see that the ways that Himes is using this to say a highly educated American woman who spoke French and Italian in addition to the very best type of cultivated idiomatic English, right, is someone who has more verbal facility than others in that particular speech community, right? And so you can see a lot of kind of ideologies going into this description, right? And so he's comparing Red Cloud to a highly educated American woman, right, who has all of this cultivation. And of course, there is no simply a basic sense in which users of Menominee of the more versatile type have a knowledge that users of White Thunder's type do not, right? And so this is where heterogeneity comes into the speech community. It's that some members of the community, those who are higher status, have more competence in the speech community's practices than those who have less power within that community. But that's not framed as ideological in any way, right? That's just framed as a linguistic fact. And so his argument, therefore, is that there is no way within the present view of linguistic competence to distinguish between the abilities of one of the pure speakers of Menominee, pure, right, noted by Bloomfield, and those of whom White Thunder was typical, right? And so he proposes communicative competence as a way of distinguishing Red Cloud and White Thunder. Red Cloud has more communicative competence, White Thunder, less communicative competence. And that's just treated as a truth, right? As an objective truth that sociolinguists discovered. It doesn't matter what White Thunder thinks about his own language practices. And so another facet to this argument is kind of the ways that communicative competence as a framework is part of the reproduction of racialized linguistic deficiency. And so Gumpertz, in addition to differentiating between those housewives and the businessmen of a white community, right, suggests that certain racialized communities fail to develop full verbal repertoire at all, right? And so his argument is that building on the culture of poverty theory, the failure of some self-contained groups to inculcate facility in verbal manipulation is a major factor in failures in their children's performance in public school systems. And so there's something about entire speech communities that's fundamentally deficient, that's fundamentally flawed, that prevents them from gaining success in schools, right? So the problem is not the schools. The problem is the language practices of the students coming into the schools. Now, Himes doesn't accept this particular framing. Instead, he frames it as a difference rather than as a deficiency, right? And his argument is that there are these interferences, what he calls sociolinguistic interferences, that happen for racialized communities between their home language practices and the school language practices that's actually at the core of their academic challenges. And so while framing it in terms of difference rather than deficiency, the root of the issue is still the same, right? The root of the issue is that there's something about the language practices of these racialized communities that's fundamentally deficient or different that needs to be addressed in order for them to receive academic success, in order for them to achieve academic success, right? So again, the schools aren't the problem, the society isn't the problem, the language practices of the students and their communities is the problem or the difference that needs to be addressed. So just putting it all together, because I know I threw a lot at you, the origins of verbal repertoire within the culture of poverty argued that unique social factors produced heterogeneity within racialized communities that prevent them from achieving facility and verbal manipulation, right? And I showed you the direct quotes, right? I'm not making this up. These are things that the scholars actually said, because I know sometimes people say that I'm making these things up. They said it, right? Communicative competence kind of is building on this culture of poverty theory, but adopted a cultural difference rather than deficiency paradigm, but maintained the assumption of the exceptional heterogeneity within racialized communities that led to, quote, sociolinguistic interference. And so this shift towards difference rather than deficiency actually doubles down on the racialized logics of the culture of poverty, while kind of like obfuscating the colonial logics that led to its emergence, right? And so still the ultimate responsibility is for racialized communities to modify their language practices to overcome the unique heterogeneity of racialization, right? So remember, whiteness, homogeneity, good. Racialization, heterogeneity, yuckiness that we need to fix, right? So the same logic continues there, kind of unaddressed. And so thinking then through an onto-epistemological critique of competence, right? Because most people aren't aware that that's the origins of communicative competence, right? But then it becomes universalized. It becomes a universal theory for understanding human communication, right? It becomes a universal theory for understanding what types of language learning need to happen. But it emerged within a specific geopolitical, racialized, racio-linguistic worldview, right? That's the point that we're trying to communicate. And so competence is framed as an empirical phenomenon that's separated from bodies, right? And this obscures the fundamental role of racialization in shaping institutional perceptions of what counts as competence, right? Which is something that Jonathan and I have been writing about for several years now, right? These perceptions. And then it frames access to global capitalism as the just deserts of those who have amassed sufficient cultural and communicative competence, with those left behind framed as victims of their own incompetence, right? So it becomes a theory of capitalism, right? Of global capitalism, of continuing to perpetuate global capitalism. Communicative competence continues to perpetuate that same capitalist ideology, right? And the same racio-linguistic ideologies that have been part of the production of global capitalism. And so in the end of the article, we suggest one of the ways that we as applied linguists can try to begin to address these issues is by shifting the locus of enunciation, right? Is by rejecting this universalizing theory of competence that is coming from a specific locus of enunciation, but has been universalized, right? And so the first step in doing that is to de-universalize in the ways that we're trying to do in this piece, right? That's what we mean by undoing competence, de-universalizing, showing its specific socio-historical context that produced it. And now we've done that. What are other ways of understanding these phenomena, right, that have been subjugated by this universalization? And so here we're inspired by the work of Wesley Leonard, who is a member of the Miami Native American group, who has been doing work as a linguist with his community, right, in efforts at language reclamation. And he has a very strong critique of the ways that outside scholars, linguists, right, make predictions about the success of the Miami language without ever having asked the Miami people what their goals are, right? In the same way that White Thunder was never asked what his goals were, right? And Leonard sees this as a problem, right? Because it continues to perpetuate colonial views of language that just aren't how the community understands their own language practices. And it's not, and it really belittles the significance that the community places on its language practices. And so from this perspective, Leonard suggests that the language isn't extinct, right, in the ways that linguists often describe it. It's sleeping, right? And it's not attrition, but change that's happening to the community. And so from this perspective, whether White Thunder possessed or lacked communicative competence isn't the issue, right? That's not the question that we should be asking about White Thunder. Instead, the question that we should be asking about White Thunder is the personal significance that his language practices had for him and his community in the face of the white settler colonialism that was serving to displace his community, right? So his community was being displaced, but that doesn't mean his language practices were inadequate. I'm sure his language practices had a great significance to him, and it's offensive that linguists think it's okay to describe his language practices as completely deficient. And yet they continue to do that to this day in many of the indigenous communities in which they work, right? And so using this shifting of the locus of enunciation, we can revisit the question that I began the presentation with that was inspired by Savannah Shangay, right? The question of why can't we learn African? And so we are inspired here by an example that was offered in the book by Uju Anya on African-American student study abroad experiences with Portuguese in Brazil, right? And she describes the experiences. I mean, she describes a lot in that book, but one of the things that we're interested in this piece is the experience of Nina, who in the United States always understood herself to be Black. Because in the United States, you don't have many other options, right? Because of the one drop rule in the United States, you're Black or you're not, right? It's a binary. In Latin America, it's not a binary, right? There are more choices. Now, anti-Blackness still provides the foundation for the colonial governance system of Latin America, right? But there are shades within that that people can choose from. And so she was debating about whether she should identify herself as negra versus morena, right? Which are two options that she had for herself now, where before in English in the United States, she only had one, right? And so Anya kind of theorizes from this experience that what Nina is doing is kind of what it meant to be a Black member of the African diaspora in a society shaped by a history of human enslavement and racial hierarchies, right? So she's arguing that Nina is working to decipher the socio-historical codes and cultural significance in ways that are helping her to develop practice of speaking Blackness, specifically in the Brazilian context. And so when I was rereading this, having thought through Shange's question of why can't we learn African, I was struck by this speaking Blackness, right? Because in many ways, it's actually showing that there is a possibility of learning African, right? Of kind of developing a way of analyzing and understanding language that actually can account for the Black diasporic experience, right? And so what this shows us is that efforts to, quote, learn African illustrate the fundamentally embodied and locally contingent nature of language learning that will never be captured by a search for universalizing competences, right? That searches for universalizing competences are by design meant to silence and subjugate this fundamentally embodied and locally contingent nature of language learning in ways that continue to perpetuate marginalization and racialization, right? And so what we're proposing is that we have to develop an approach to applied linguistics that centers the embodied experiences of racialized communities over the universalizing of whiteness, right? And so what do I do with this information tomorrow, right? And I ask this because I know that many of you are thinking this, because I know that many of us in applied linguistics have a strong commitment to thinking through issues of practice. But I also want us to be a little careful with how we do this, right? Because I think sometimes we want to go immediately to the solutions, but we still haven't correctly identified the problem that should be addressing, right? So sometimes it's okay to spend time trying to really understand the problem and how that problem is manifested in your local community before trying to immediately go to the solution, right? So all of that is to say, I think it's important for us to be skeptical of any demands for universally applicable, immediately practical implications of any framework, right? And so I developed my framework in the context of the United States. Now, colonialism, however, is not unique to the United States, and racialization is not unique to the United States, right? There are unique ways that race and racialization have worked in the United States, and that definitely informs my thinking on these issues. But racialization and colonialism was a global redesign, right? And so it's important for us to really think about the ways that colonial logic and processes of racialization are playing out differently in different local contexts. And so I won't be able to answer for you those processes because I'm not familiar with your context, right? It would be your job to kind of think through how these processes are working in your context. And I can certainly be a thought partner with you when thinking through that, right? But that you really are the expert in your context and have to think through how colonial logic and processes of racialization are working within the communities in which you are embodied, right, and live. And so, but also be wary of any and all efforts at developing a new universalizing competence. And I say applied linguists love taking cool things that people do with language and turning it into a competence. Don't do that. Please don't do that because it takes the life out of all of it, right? And makes it something that we have to now evaluate, right? And I would encourage people to resist siloing away racial-linguistics, meaning, like sociolinguistics, right? Once you name something a noun, it makes it a discipline that now people think needs to have boundaries around it, right? And so now what that does is say, I don't have to worry about race because the racial-linguists are doing it. Let the racial-linguists do that. And I'll continue to use my universally applicable theories of competence without thinking about how they're embedded in colonial logics. No, I don't want that to happen. So I would resist the siloing away of like people who are doing race and people who are not, because our whole argument is that if you're not accounting for race, you are reifying a colonial framework, right? And you can't just dismiss that by saying, oh, the racial linguist can figure that out. But also, connected back to my point about the specific ways this plays out in local context, I think it's important for us to be wary of doubling down on essentialist views of language and race, right? So sometimes when people hear me talk, they're immediately interpreting what I say through a US framework, and they're saying, that doesn't apply to us because we're not in the US, we don't have these problems. And I say, one, anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon, right? Settler colonialism has shaped the global world, right? Imperialism was part of the reconfiguration of the world. So race and racialization has played out everywhere, right? But once we reject essentialist views, we can begin to understand how categories can shift across time and can work differently in different contexts. And that our job isn't to decide who's this group and who's that group, but our job is to understand how these categorizations are being used to manage populations, right? And how it's being used to marginalize people. And also, finally, in terms of what do I do tomorrow with this information, remember, and always remember this, I'm always thinking about this myself, there's a fine line between pragmatism and complicity, right? I understand that those of us who work in schools, those of us who work with communities, have to adopt pragmatism and kind of doing things that are going to have real practical effects on the communities and schools that we're working with. However, if we simply accept the framing of the debate as is, and don't continue to try to challenge it, eventually we just become complicit in producing the very system that we would like to think that we're undermining, right? And so the question that I'll leave you with, that I think all of you should be thinking about in your own context, and we can maybe talk about this in the conversation, are how are you shifting the locus of enunciation in your research, teaching, and advocacy work in ways that embrace the embodied and locally contingent nature of language learning in order to better understand the alternative worlds that already exist, while also working to create new ones, right? Because if all we're doing is trying to make the current world a little less harmful, then that really kind of stifles our imagination, right? I think we can't be afraid to really push our imagination and push knowledge in new ways, because I think that's really one of our ethical responsibilities, especially as academics who are doing research, right? So that said, thank you so much for this listening, and I'm sure I will be hearing thoughts from some of the people on this seminar.
Thank you so much. I'm continuously amazed at your capacity, Nelson. Now, I won't use the word competency. Capacity to make something which is complex and theoretical, but totally accessible to the educated lay person. And the last slide is especially important because I see that applied linguistics, educational linguistics, language and education scholars or academics, we tend to reduce everything to a technical issue of pedagogy
Yes.
or curriculum design. So, and then we lose the deeper picture that you outlined so forcefully, that is shifting the locus of enunciation. Now, this is a fancy word. For those out there, it just means shifting your position of judging other people. As applied linguists, as educational linguists, our position of judgment, as you and Rosa so powerfully, is the right listening subject. That is, we judge ourselves, not using our own lenses, but use the location the position of the colonizer, the so-called colonialism slangs, the Queen's English, King's English now. So, and whatever. And also the second point you mentioned, the last slide, resist siloing away racial linguistics or EDI, or we see so much like that happening. Oh, we have created an associate dean in whatever, indigenous education or EDI, equity, diversity. So let the associate dean do it, or let that committee do it. I can just carry on with my whatever I'm doing. So anyway, I will turn the floor over to our doctoral student host. So Pedro, you can coordinate the questions and the interactions. Pedro, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Flores. It was a very good talk. I had goosebumps here many times. Some of us wrote some questions. I would like to read one of the questions that Gahian wrote, because I think it's a good point for us to start discussing, coming from the recommendations that you provide at the end. So Gahyun, she is a doctoral student at SFU as well with us, and then she's interested in the process of undoing competence for young multilingual researchers and educators in language education regarding one's identity. So she's a Korean and learns academic English for communicative competence in college. And she agrees that with the concept, it's very related to the genre of the human that is overrepresented as white, just like you put very well in your presentation. So she's calling herself a victim of white supremacy because she reinforced and regenerated the dominant language ideologies when she was also teaching English. So her question is, how can she accept herself in the past? How can she reconcile the Gahyun from the past with the one now in the present that is more critical and then can recognize this? Because she thinks that this question would resonate with many multilingual teachers and teacher educators who are trying to find this way. So let's hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that I also, I mean, it resonates with me in the sense that I originally my professional trajectory into where I am now began as a ESL teacher in the Bronx who was working with students who were born in the US, but they were still classified as English learners in high school, right? And I was using the frameworks that I had learned in my teacher education to try to make sense of how this could be, right? And I was using the framework of academic language, Bix and Calp, which I know you all are familiar with in Canada. And I ended up feeling kind of tension in that, like, I was describing students as lacking something and I needed to fix it. And yet they were using English and Spanish kind of to do all kinds of innovative things with language that weren't being recognized by the school and by the school system and by the society, right? And so eventually this got me to thinking about, wait a minute, actually, it's not the students that are the problem at all, right? It's the perceptions of their language practices from the broader society that are the problem, right? So I think that, so the question of like, well, the question of what we do with our past selves is that I think we're compassionate with our past selves. Like, I think we're kind of constantly learning and kind of working to be better. And so long as we are continuously critically interrogating the assumptions that we're making, that's all we can do, right? So I would be kind of, we grow and we continue to grow, and that's great. But I do think it's also important for us to critically interrogate not just the ideologies of academic language and who gets positioned as using academic language, but also what academic language actually is, right? Or academic English or academic anything. So if we go back to kind of my presentation in terms of homogeneity of language being an ideological construction, right? And so from my perspective, language is inherently heterogeneous. And then boundaries are constructed around language as ideologies that produce kind of this sense that there's a homogeneity of language. And so even what we name as academic discourse or academic language or academic English is fundamentally heterogeneous. We may not perceive it that way because we've named it something, and so we give it this ideology of homogeneity. But if you look closely at what people are doing that counts as academic English or academic anything, people are doing a range of different things. And oftentimes it's perceived as academic English because they have doctorates or because they have high social status, right? And so all of that is to say, if we can recognize the inherent heterogeneity of what counts as academic, then we can also begin to have more robust conversations in our classes with students about how they want to position themselves in relation to these boundaries, right? And some students may decide, I kind of want to stick within what seem like conventional boundaries, right? And that's not my decision to make for them, right? That's their decision to make for themselves. If I'm telling them they can't do that, then I'm policing their language practices in the same way that I'm suggesting that we shouldn't, right? But other students may say, oh, you mean like I can actually bring my own voice to this? I can like change this up in ways that reflect my identity. And I can play with the conventions here in ways that feel authentic to who I am as a person. What might that look like, right? How can I experiment with that? And so I think when we begin to deconstruct those boundaries, I think we also then allow for more robust conversations about what it is that we're actually doing under this banner of academic English, which may then open up more spaces for experimentation and playfulness in classrooms that oftentimes are quite stifled right now because of these bounded notions of language, which inherently lead to policing of language, which oftentimes teachers don't want to do. But if you have boundaries, you become the border patrol, right? You become the border patrol of those boundaries. And the only way not to be is to realize the ideological nature of those boundaries and allowing people to play with them and kind of remap them in new ways.
Thank you so much for the response. Yeah, absolutely. Being compassionate to our former selves. Hopefully that the new ones are more critical and then question these structures, right? Okay.
Right. I mean, I'm sure I did a lot of harm to my students using the deficit ideologies I was using, right? And I, rather than saying, "Oh my God, I was such a horrible person," I say, "Well, what were the discourses that I had available to myself at that moment, and how can I, as someone who thinks those discourses now are harmful, create new discourses that would be available to people who are in that position now who could do different things," right?
So in that way, your education is emancipatory, like emancipating them and then making them think about what is happening to them as well, like involving your learners, right, in the process.
Right. I call that kind of like supporting students in exploring language rather than policing students' language.
Mm-hmm.
Which again, and I think that like to Angel's earlier point, like we want to be careful to make those technical issues the root of the problem, but I do think that teaching matters, right? I wouldn't be in educational linguistics if I didn't. And I think good teachers matter. And I've had amazing teachers who really have had an impact on me, right? So I do think that teachers can matter. I just think that we oftentimes put a lot of responsibility on teachers that really are outside of their control. I do think that teachers can adopt different approaches to language that afford more affirming approaches in their classroom. And I do think that matters. But we need broader structural transformation to really see the type of change that we want to see happening.
If I could jump in with a question there, because I see elsewhere that Hilary Chang, the South African critical literacy scholar, has talked about how to overcome this access paradox. I'd like to pick your brain on her views, because
Yeah, I mean, I would have to look back at it. I haven't read her articles in I mean, I don't remember the last time I read her article. Maybe it was in grad school. I'm trying to remember. But if I remember it correct, I mean, I guess what I would say in terms of the more general way people think about critical literacy, and I think maybe Jenks is part of that, and is I think that what like a translanguaging perspective brings to that is an explicit understanding of the ideological nature of boundaries and the inherent heterogeneity that we all engage in. And I think that does then afford new ways of thinking about access, right? Because access is oftentimes thought of, if you've mastered these codes, you will then have access to something. But like a racial-linguistic perspective, which is of course building on translanguaging, suggests you can have access to all of the codes you want. If you're a particular social status or racialized person, you're always going to have that barrier to full recognition and full legitimacy within the existing institutions, right? And I think that to some extent that was like part of where we were coming from in kind of our reading of Lisa Delpit's work in the Undoing Appropriateness article, which was very much about kind of teaching students the codes of power and being sympathetic to that argument, right? Because it is coming from a critical perspective. It is acknowledging the issues of power, but I think there's oftentimes, at least in the Delpit work that we were looking at, still the assumption that these codes were homogeneous things that existed in the world outside of any individual who used them. And I think that the perspective that we're bringing in brings kind of issues of embodiment in more and challenges the idea that these boundaries are actually there, and also that these boundaries are oftentimes shifting based on the convenience of those in power, right? So those in power can use all kinds of codes that are typically seen as marginalized when used by other people, right? And oftentimes they can get cachet through doing that, and they can get power to doing that. I mean, Bourdieu talks about them like the strategies of condescension, right? Where elite people can use marginalized codes, and it's fine, right? Because they already are legitimate users of language institutionally, and so they can do whatever they want, right? And yet other people who are trying to inhabit this dominant code will always be perceived as engaging in devious codes and inappropriate codes because of their race, because of their gender, because of their other forms of social differentiation, right?
Exactly. To bring out this point, I think Qinghua emailed me this example of there is some Caucasian speaker who can order food in Chinese, and then his video goes viral and everybody's celebrating it. It's such a good example of your point about the legitimate speaker, because they're already privileged, and then they can do whatever they like, and then they get extra credit.
Right. And then I mean, one of the examples that I've written about before is Melania Trump's daughter using Mandarin. Ivanka Trump's daughter, using Mandarin, and it being like, oh my God, this is great. And like from the same Trump supporters who are completely xenophobic, right? And think that like, if it were a Chinese person using Mandarin, we'd probably like feel threatened and maybe even attack them, right? Yeah.
So many Japanese, so many other speakers are using English to order food all the time. Why don't we get credit?
Right. And I remember at the time when Ivanka Trump's daughter was being celebrated for using Mandarin, there was like, I don't remember what university it was, that a memo had been sent to Chinese students not to use Mandarin in public areas, right? Because it was making other students uncomfortable. And so it's like, wait a minute, like Ivanka Trump's daughter using Mandarin, yay, this is great. Like actual Chinese people don't do that. It makes people uncomfortable.
Kubota in one of her papers was saying she was in Vancouver and overhearing some people talking in Chinese, and then she overheard some Caucasian speaker say, "Stop speaking Chinese in Vancouver. This is Canada." Right. But okay, examples aside, I like to pay respect to Alan Luke, because I think Alan Luke, we need to pay respect to him, because back into 1990s, he wrote the article "Genres of Power," in critique of genre-based pedagogy. I mean, of course, we all use genre-based pedagogy. He's just saying that this is not a solution to the issue of racism, and because once you can use the genres, you can use the target language, and then they will say you are people of color, you are still not meeting our standard. As Jonathan Rosser says, it's never, they will come up with something else. You are always falling short of their benchmarks coming from their locus of enunciation.
And I think what's interesting with what you're saying there is that, like, in every generation, there have been scholars that have been making similar points, right? And so one of the ones that we cite in the article is an article by James Sled in the 1960s that argued that the bidialectalism that like Lebovian sociolinguistics was advocating and getting tons of foundation money to support was what he called the linguistics of white supremacy, right? And so every generation, there are scholars who have made similar points about the kind of fundamentally racialized nature of how language is perceived. And oftentimes they've been pushed out or like set aside or cited, but like not really in the ways that like the argument is actually suggesting. I mean, I never had heard of Sled until I did some of my own genealogical work and came across him. He apparently was fairly prominent in composition and rhetoric, which I think makes more sense. I think composition and rhetoric maybe has been a little more politicized in terms of its theories of language for quite some time. But sociolinguistics, he's not typically talked about as a founder of the field.
I still would like to pay respect to Monica Heller, because I remember in the 1990s in OIC Toronto, in my first class in her course, Culture, Language, Literacy, she was mentioning we should move from the view of deficit to difference, but even difference is not enough. Move the view of difference to dominance. The issue is dominance. It's not, these disadvantaged children have a linguistic deficit, or, slightly more progressive, these minoritized children, they're just speaking differently, very liberalist, but we should move. Actually, it's about the dominance. Okay, over to you, Pedro, again.
Now, I'm going to ask Phoebe to ask her question. Phoebe, please.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing a lot of issues about undoing competence. My question mainly is how to reshape our understanding with assessment and learning, because you mentioned that as teachers, we need to guide our colleagues and students to look at the potentials, not just the problems. But of course, I feel thankful that you mentioned that we shouldn't be too, aggressive in just solving all the problems observed. So in terms of your recent article about language architects and also the architecture that we can co-create, what are the examples that we may bring into our socially equitable classrooms or campus design to bring the perspective and inspire the students and colleagues to understand that when we mention competence, we don't just want to focus on the linguistics aspect. We may also have the cultural aspect and visual aspect and a lot of multimodal embodiments of how you feel that you are empowered as learners or as individuals. How would you suggest this kind of improvements in our education?
So I think that the term language architecture I use in that piece mostly because I think when a lot of people hear the term translanguaging, they're thinking going across multiple named languages, right? And that's not my understanding of translanguaging. My understanding of translanguaging is shifting the locus of enunciation, right, to racialized, bi, multilingual people, and then using that shift in the locus of enunciation to create a new orientation to language, right? Which is this heterogeneous kind of conception of language where we all cross linguistic borders all the time, right? We're all doing it right now, right? We're all doing it. And so I use language architecture there as a way of trying to get people not to think of things solely in terms of named languages, right? Because I think when we begin to see translanguaging as just describing specific language practices, I think that falls back into the same empiricist trap that I was warning us not to fall into of these language practices are translanguaging and these are not. And then it continues to otherize the language practices of those who engage in translanguaging, right? These people over here do translanguaging. Isn't that cool? We like it, but it's still different than like this normal form of communication, which is like what these people are doing that's not translanguaging. So I say all of that to say that I do think that the frameworks that translanguaging has developed to think about curriculum design are a point of entry for thinking about these things. So in the language architecture piece, I was specifically thinking about debates around academic language, right? Well, that was a special issue that it was in, and that was, I've written quite a bit about Bix and Kalb and kind of these problems with this dichotomous frame. And so in that piece, I was trying to think of what a non-dichotomous view of language would afford, right, in classrooms, and how that could be used to at least kind of resist the reification of racial-linguistic ideologies in a classroom, right? And I think that some of the work in translanguaging that I think aligns with that are the three kind of like, what do they call them? Components, right? Of like translanguaging documentation, right? Where you are trying to get a sense of what language practices that are in the community, right? That you can then kind of bring into the classroom through translanguaging rings, right? Which are making connections like a ring, right? Between language practices that students already know and language practices that maybe are a little more unfamiliar to them, or audiences and purposes and goals that may be a little more unfamiliar to them. So how are you making the links, right? The rings between the language practices they already know and newer language practices in ways that don't suggest that they're somehow in opposition to one another. The goal should be eventually what they call translanguaging transformations, right? Which I'm calling language architecture, right? Which is allowing students to appropriate these new language practices in ways that kind of reflect their own unique identities and selves, right? And so when you take that as the framework, then I think you begin to think through how to develop curriculum. And I'm not a curriculum designer, right? But I would leave that as the framework that curriculum designers can then begin to think through in developing an actual curriculum that resist the reification of dichotomous views of language that are connected to broader racial-linguistic ideologies and broader colonial histories.
Okay, I'd like to jump in with two questions from the audience on YouTube. Okay,
Hi.
with audience. So I think the two are related. One is from Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. You are saying, aren't all speech communities inherently heterogeneous, since everyone should be part of multiple speech communities, smaller or larger? And then another question from Jason Ho. He was asking, I love the notion of not nominalizing racial linguistics and your arguments for denaturalizing competence. Do you see some kind of tendency to essentializing queer linguistics and gay speech, like lesbian speech, about reification of these entities?
Yes, so I can start with the second one, maybe. Yeah, I do think that we need to be wary of any reifications, right? Reifications that we ourselves are naturalizing, right? So people in the world are going to use categories to make sense of their lives, and we do too, right? And as researchers, we can try to understand how they're making sense of their lives and the ways they're trying to make sense of their lives. But when we begin to kind of say, these are the boundaries between this language and that language, I think we've already adopted a particular racial-linguistic worldview that accepts boundaries between languages, right? And I can give like just a concrete example from kind of my own life, right? So I grew up in a bilingual home, English and Spanish. I grew up speaking what I thought was English. For the most part, I understood Spanish, but as a kid, I would respond in what I thought was English. But there were some words that were the only words that we used at my home, so I assumed that they were English words, right? And then I went to school, and for other people, they were not English words. They didn't know what I was saying, right? So then I learned that for other people, they were Spanish words. So what can a linguist do with that? So a linguist could say, I was code switching or doing something and I didn't know I was doing it. And like I actually was using Spanish words when I should have been using English words, and maybe I had a lack of competence, right? They could say that. Or they could try to understand my locus of enunciation and the meaning making that I'm making of the world, and not universalize this other perspective, right? And I think that we can do that as researchers, right? Rather than saying this person is definitely using this language or that language, we can ask people what languages they think they're using and why, right? And to what effect. And that's a way of trying to understand how boundaries are constructed without reifying the boundaries as existing before humans create them, right? And so I think that also gets to the question of speech communities. I mean, I think that there are debates in the field now about like whether speech community is a term people want to use anymore. Some people say yes, but like think of them as heterogeneous. Others say no, we should use communities of practice. And like others are saying like none of these bounded notions really can capture things at all. And so I think that that's kind of like an existential crisis in the field right now. But I would say any community, whatever we call it, I would agree with the comment that it's inherently heterogeneous, but that oftentimes ideologies produce a sense that there's a homogeneity that somehow is essential to that community. And that's where we begin to get to these bounded ideas that oftentimes have long colonial histories.
Yes, totally. I want to attach what you're saying to my own use of first order languaging, translanguaging performances to second order or nth order descriptions, which can be what you call a code, a system, a name
Right.
language, right? And of course, we all make use of second order entities, right? Because that's how we make sense of the world. But as soon as we universalize it, naturalize it, and put them onto a hierarchy, then we are all being complicit in the whatever ideologies behind this
Correct.
hierarchy. Yes.
Correct. And I think if people are honest and upfront about that, I can at least say we can agree to disagree, right? We have different ideologies. I think that oftentimes people are not upfront that they are reifying particular racial-linguistic worldviews. And that's where I think the problem lies.
They totally have taken it for granted.
Right,
It's common
right.
sense. Say they don't think it's ideology. This is
No, they think that we're ideological. They're
we
not.
are ideological. They
And
are just
I say we're all ideological, and I own my ideological position, right? I'm really upfront about my locus of enunciation and what I'm trying to do, and I'm just asking for you to do the same thing.
yeah. And I think Ryoko Kubota is saying the same thing about
Mhm.
researchers. That whenever we do our research, present our research, we need to make explicit our own locus of enunciation.
Right. And she's been doing this work for a long time too, right? She's an example of one of the scholars that we've been talking about who've been saying these things for a long time. And, you know, hopefully we can finally like shift the paradigms.
Yes. We need new blood, new generation to carry on the
We
work.
see that that's for everyone here, all of you who are finishing up your doctoral work, and from what I'm hearing, like you are going to be the ones that are leading this work.
Xinhua, do you have any questions to ask?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Flores. I have a question here that I received just now on my WeChat from my friend Carol. She's also a visiting scholar in Canada, and she's from Fudan University in Shanghai. She has an interesting question that she would like to ask you. The question reads like, how would you critique the very field of racial linguistics? And she made it. She said that the concept of race is like an American, somehow more like an American issue. So how would you like decolonize the onto-epistemological critique of the very field of racial linguistics? That's her question for you.
Yeah, I mean, I love that it's coming from WeChat too. We're like all connected to all of these different things. And I'll just say that I think I disagree that race is a US concept. I think that there are specific ways that race and racialization have worked in the US, right? But I think that if we define race as determining who counts as human and who counts as less than fully human, right, then we have to think about the ways that racialization has been played in any context of colonialism. So one of the articles that I have students read in one of my courses is the author's last name is Nishiyama. And he calls racism beyond race, because he's trying to think about kind of biopolitics in a Foucauldian kind of framework outside of the Eurocentric ideas of race. And he looks at the ways that the Japanese, as part of the Meiji Restoration and as part of the colonization of Korea, were using the same ideologies of race and racialization to racialize Koreans, right? And to position them as less than fully human as part of the justification for their colonization of Korea, right? So I think that when we assume that race is just a US thing, what we're doing is erasing the colonial logics that shaped all modern societies. But I do think it's important to think through the ways that categories may be different in different contexts, right? So in the US context, we wouldn't think of Japanese and Korean as different racial groups, right? There's a different history in the United States, and kind of Asianness is racialized in the US in very particular ways. But in the Japanese context, the distinction between Japanese as trying to emulate whiteness, right, as trying to inhabit this position of the modern human, Korean became an important other, right, that was part of the construction of the superior Japanese identity. And so I don't think that a racial-linguistic perspective needs to be a perspective that's just relevant in the US or even the Americas, because I think that we can't argue. I mean, the Americas are all settler colonials. I don't think that we could say in the Americas there's not race. Certainly in Canada, I hope that people aren't implying that Canada doesn't have issues of race and racism, because Canada definitely does. But even outside of the Americas, we can think about this framework of genres of the human and kind of constructions of race and racialization, and how that plays out in different contexts.
I really like your idea of the genre of the human, because in ancient Chinese history, we might not use the word race, but we do have this binary distinction, categorical distinction between barbarian and civilized.
Well, and that often then gets mapped on to more contemporary categories.
And that's we live in the South. I happen to live in the South, okay? The Nan Man is the southern barbarians. They might not use the exact wording race, but they even worse. They call them worms. They call them worms, okay?
Right,
Nan
yeah.
Man.
And I think in many contexts, people will talk about it.
Worms. The barbarian word in Chinese, in the character, it got two worms. Okay, so barbarians meaning worms. They're not human.
I mean, that's definitely dehumanizing. I would argue that that's definitely racializing. And I think in many societies, people will use the term ethnicity rather than race, but they're really talking about racialization, right? And sometimes religion becomes the proxy for racialization. And
so they might not use this exact wording race, but they have the genre of the human that you mentioned so well. That you are human, you are not human, you're just worms, maybe two worms together. Look at the Chinese character, Nan Man, the Man, two worms, okay, in the character. We are multiple worms. Those living in the South, we're not even human, not even mammals, we're just worms. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's good. That's a good example, right? That's a good example.
So could Pedro read the questions from other doctoral hosts who are not able to come today?
Yes. So I have a question from Dr. Bongison. She's from the University of Winnipeg, and she's a former postdoc that was working with us here in the channel. So she is an educator, and she's using English as an additional language in the post-secondary level. and she has a question about the boundaries that we can have to decolonize the linguistic practice of minoritized and racialized students in the academic level, because she's talking about academic language, and I sympathize with her, because we teach academic language, and the universities where we are working, they have this discourse of decolonizing education, of decolonizing higher education here in Canada, and we hear that a lot. But at the same time, we are sometimes complicit with these practices that promote a view of academic language that is the one that the students have to achieve. And then in the continuation of her question, she talks about Indigenous students. If creating this way of boundaries, like giving voices to them, to their repertoires, if that would help them and help this endeavor of decolonizing. What are your thoughts about that? I don't know if I put the question in a good way.
Right. So, I mean, I do think that we have to be wary of how the term decolonizing gets used to describe everything at this point, right? Yeah. I don't think that you can decolonize concepts and frameworks that are fundamentally colonial, right? I think that you need new logics. And that's not to say that the work that people are doing isn't important, but I do think that we shouldn't call something decolonizing if what we're doing is something that's fundamentally colonial. I think we can make it less harmful, right? But I wouldn't call that decolonizing. But I thinking about kind of boundary creating, right? I think the question becomes who's creating the boundaries, why they're creating the boundaries, for what purposes, right? And so this academic language, oftentimes who's creating the boundary? Powerful people. Why are they creating the boundaries as a gatekeeping tool? Like that, you can't decolonize that. Like that's just, it is what it is. But the question about Indigenous people, right, I think is an important one to think about. So I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't use boundaries to make sense of their own language practices, right? But once we reject this universalized idea of language, that actually is going to allow us to try to take seriously naming practices and ways of kind of construction ideas around language that aren't coming from a Eurocentric epistemology, right? Yeah. And so Indigenous communities have been naming their language practices since they've been around, right? Everyone names their language practices. And as I think Wesley Leonard was challenging in the piece that we cite in our article, oftentimes those those naming practices are seen as, at best, unenlightened, and at worst, undermining to the goals that the linguists think they should have for their language practices, right? And so once we say, wait, linguists, stop universalizing that colonial logic, then we can actually begin to understand better the naming practices of the communities themselves, right? And the boundary making that they're creating around their language practices. And maybe they're not creating boundaries. Maybe they're doing something completely different in terms of how they're naming their language practices. But because we've universalized this bounded notion of language, we're unable to imagine or kind of comprehend that people may have different ways of making sense of their language practices outside of these boundaries. But we can't do that until we've deconstructed and kind of de-universalized this one perspective.
I think that a follow-up question would be, if we want to include Indigenous students at university here, and they have to learn academic language, which is a white construct. So I think that the question would be, how can we construct that with them? I teach Indigenous students here in Canada, and I teach academic language to them. But what I do is to tell them, look, this is what happened. You know the history that affected Indigenous populations here in Canada, and you also are at university, and you want to take advantage of the resources that are here, and then navigate the discourses of the disciplines. So I try to make them aware of the boundaries that are in their institutions as well, the opportunities for them to learn this language and then participate in the discourses as well. And
So I think to get back to the point of race being only a U.S. thing, clearly race is an issue in Canada, right?
It is, absolutely. Yes,
But,
I was nodding when you said, I hope someone in Canada is studying that. Yeah, but, it is.
But I think this gets back to what I was saying before about what we understand academic language to be. I think that there's this ideology that universities are teaching this homogeneous code, but that's actually not what's happening, right? They're doing a range of different things. I'm sure the way that you teach academic language is very different than the way I would teach it, is very different than the way Angel would teach it. We would all have different notions and ideas of what that actually means, right? So I think rather than seeing the boundaries as we have to teach them these boundaries, I think the question becomes, how do we get them to understand that these boundaries are actually ideologically produced and that what's actually happening in universities are much more heterogeneous than that? And then how do we then help them to think through the types of boundaries that they want to create for themselves in order to navigate the space? So that the boundaries are coming from them rather than these kind of ideologically constructed boundaries that actually, like if we actually did discourse analysis of 5 different classrooms at your university, I would guarantee you that there would be 5 different conceptualizations of what academic language actually is. Right? Yeah. And I think rather than continuing to pretend that everyone is doing the same thing, let's start deconstructing what we even mean by academic language as a way of helping students to see themselves and position themselves in relation to that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's important to consider that because competence is embedded in the way that people are going to create assessment for the students in a way that they're going to say, yes, they can move on to the next year if they are in introductory year programs, for example. So it's really important to interrogate these practices and see how competence is designed based on this one idea of academic language. Yeah.
You touched the $1 million word, Pedro, assessment. I need to pick your brain on it, Nelson. Because assessment is usually kind of like we have, you know, the Monkey King in this in a Journey to the West story, the ancient Chinese story. The monkey, no matter how innovative, how agentic, full of agency, but when the Buddha says the mantra, and then because he has this golden ring on his head, this assessment is kind of like this golden ring on all academics' head or all language teachers, language education's head. Assessment. Then the parents, then the school administrators, the students themselves will say, give me what we need to do the assessment. So I'd like to pick your brain. What's your stance on assessment and how we are going to tackle this golden ring?
So, I mean, I'm not an assessment person, right? And there's a reason for why I'm not. So I can only speak kind of just based on my own limited knowledge of assessment. But what I would say is that I think that we need to, I mean, if we truly kind of accept this need to undo competence, then we have to, and we really accept the locally contingent embodied nature of language, then we're going to have to completely redesign what we understand assessment to be, right? Assessments cannot be the TOEFL, that's this universal assessment that's used in every context. It's going to have to be locally developed from the ground up, right?
Or whatever internal academic literacy tests.
Right. And Constance Leung has a great article that came out pretty recently on thinking through a locally developed view of proficiency. So he's not necessarily talking about test design, but he is thinking through, he's kind of deconstructing. I mean, it's interesting because he's coming at it from a slightly different theoretical point of entry, although he does translanguaging, but he's thinking through kind of what he calls the bulge model of communication that's oftentimes kind of universalized native speaker appropriate proficiency as like the target, and is suggesting, but that's actually not even how most language learners in the world are going to use language, right? They're not actually learning language to communicate with an idealized native speaker of that language. And so there's a mismatch between what we are saying proficiency is, because we've adopted this universalized view of what proficiency is or what competence is, and the actual uses that they are going to have for language, right? So I think that the first step becomes really thinking through what exactly is the point of assessment. Is it to assess this universalized ideal competence that no one actually needs? Or is it to provide guidance and support for people who are actually learning to communicate in ways that are actually going to be relevant to them in their local context? I think it should be the second, and I think there are formative assessments and things like that that are the second. But I think what becomes tricky there, of course, is that there's so much money going into the big universal ones that that's going to be a big hill.
And also gatekeeping function, the gatekeeping
right.
of the status quo, the establishment. Yeah.
I would like to jump in the answer, because one of my of the questions that I wrote here during your presentation was that you were concerned with not changing the concept of communicative competence into something else that continues reproducing the same thing. And you were talking about, Angel was talking about IELTS and TOEFL. And then it reminded me of practices that universities here in Canada started doing. I don't know in the US, but people started criticizing IELTS and TOEFL. And then they said, okay, so now we're going to accept the Duolingo test because it's more accessible. And then it's an app that you can practice, then you can pay, but it's the same thing. So, and then it called my attention to that. So it's really important for us to not to change. And it's the same thing for assessment. It's not only to change, okay, so let's not do this practice, and then start doing something else that continues to reproduce the same thing.
Right. I mean, and I think that part of the issue is also how do we find spaces to do other things, even though the system itself maybe is intact still, right? I think we continue to try to dismantle the system, right? But that's like long-term, right? Pie in the sky, maybe will never happen. And then we find the ways of developing more locally developed forms of proficiency and assessment that can supplement and provide counter-narrative to students that they don't internalize these universalized proficiencies that are unrelated to what they actually need language for, right? And so I think it's a both and, right? I think we find spaces to do these more locally kind of culturally sustaining approaches while also continuing to speak back to these broader institutional, ideological, structural issues.
Phoebe, I think that this comment relates to your question, your area 2 question.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. Yes, I agree that we need to handle assessment expectations from parents, school authorities as well. But very often nowadays, because we try to not use black and white paperwork to assess students all the time. Sometimes we have e-portfolio design and also more digitalized way or multimodal ways of assessment. My second question today would be, nowadays a lot of schools are very eager to develop metaverse project, visualize a lot of communicative repertoire through very beautiful animated design of educational resources. So what would you see for using this kind of renovated language architecture or architectural design or landscape design to, mobilize more energy and also self-confidence for the young learners to get connected to their content specialism or subject specialism? And would it be a way to empower us through creating the third space with a lot of imagination and creativity? Because I personally love visiting museums and also art galleries. And when I visit a unique place, I always go to the arts gallery and cultural museum, history museum to look at what influenced the ethnic groups of that particular geographical location. So all these are so meaningful in our education and understanding of language and identity and culture as well. But it seems that in terms of assessment, we are using a monolingual and also logo-centric way to measure competence. So how can we break through technology and also the metaverse creation nowadays? That's my question in mind. I'm not sure if I articulate.
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. That's really outside of my area of expertise. But what I would say is the more ways that we can localize our pedagogy and assessment practices so that they're aligned with how students may actually be using language in the world and need it in the world, the better. But I'm not an expert on technology or the arts. I mean, it sounds like you have a better sense of how it might happen. I think that would be, I don't know what your dissertation is on, but that could be an interesting dissertation project to kind of think through how these multimedia forms of technology can maybe develop these more localized forms of assessment and proficiency that don't universalize and kind of come from these universalized monoglossic bad ideologies.
Okay. Thank you so much. I am aware of the time, but I know that Tsinghua has a question to you, Dr. Flores.
So maybe this was the last one?
Yeah, maybe that will be the last one.
Okay, thank you very much for allowing me the chance to ask the last question for you. So I want to ask this question. I will ask the question first. Do you think that the theories and your paper is like maybe appropriate and suitable for everyone to understand the theory and constructs? I introduced it to one of my friends, and he felt like that his life has changed. And now when he enters a restaurant, he expect him like in the past he would expect himself to enter a Western restaurant. He would expect himself to behave, in a Western way. He felt the pressure to do that, to use that kind of language. And and then when he enter like maybe an Asian restaurant, he don't feel that kind of pressure. But now after that, he begins to pay so much attention whether he was like treated fairly in a Western restaurant, and if he is not receiving like good service in that restaurant, he feel very bad about it. He feel like it's discrimination, and he also feel like he expect much less in maybe an Asian restaurant like that. So I feel he has been sharing this with me. He said that his everyday experiences have changed after he got to know like theories about race, because in the past he's totally oblivious of that. So my question here is like how to, if we cannot change the system all of a sudden overnight, so like what other strategies, like maybe personal strategies, that we can take care of our well-being?
Yeah, I think that that's important, right? I think that consciousness raising, for lack of a better word, right, is oftentimes painful, right? Because we become aware of ways that we've been harmed or ways that we've harmed others that don't feel good, right? And I think that for me, I think theory is part of my effort and attempt to cope with that, right? It provides me a more holistic way of understanding my own experiences and the experiences of others, right? And it allows me to locate the problem somewhere else, right? Not to say that I'm never a problem. I certainly have problems, but I mean, in terms of like language, in terms of like issues of identity and things like that, the problem was never me, right? And the problem was never my students. The problem was always the institutions, and me as an agent of an institution is sometimes the problem, right? And I find that to be comforting in some ways, right? To be able to explain to myself what exactly is happening. And then to see that, like, even just to hear your anecdote now, like people reading it and feeling like it resonates with their experience, as someone who I've never met and someone whose experience is no doubt is very different than mine, it spoke to them, right? And it gave them a new way of thinking through what was happening to them and realizing that maybe some of the ways that they were being treated wasn't okay, right? And that they shouldn't have to put up with that. So it's like, I think that like feeling these connections with others who the work speaks to, is also a way of me to take care of myself, right? And that's really, I mean, I don't really know who my audience is a lot of the time, but I'm interested in speaking and writing and doing work for people who feel like the work is speaking to them, right? Who feel that the work is naming experiences that they've experienced. And I encourage all of you to think of theory that way too, right? Of finding ways to make sense of things that have happened to you and locating the problems not in yourself and how you can use it to build solidarity with others who maybe have different experiences than you, but that framework is something that you have in common now, right? And you can use to like support one another and mobilize to support one another in your advocacy work.
Thank you very much for your answer.
This is really the last one from Donggi. She was saying, could you please speak to how your undoing competence can be related to intersectionality, like intersection of gender, race, class. That is how to approach both racial justice and justice related to other axes of social difference, like sexuality, using racial linguistics or ideas.
Right. So I think that the axes are in the end all one axis, right? Like, I think that we can't understand colonial logics without understanding the ways that like race was produced as a way of sorting populations into those who are more or less human. And then the kind of heteronormative nuclear family was imposed as part of kind of the construction of this, right? In terms of who are those who are most human, they're the ones that have the real families, not the ones who have extended families or the ones who have queer families. And you can't think about, and you definitely can't think about race without thinking about social class, right? Because race is part of the construction and perpetuation of global capitalism, right? And so, and we can't think about any of these things without disability, right? Because disability is also part of the construction of the normal and the abnormal. And discourses of race and racialization and discourses of disability are oftentimes very aligned with one another. And so rather than seeing them as separate axes, right, I think that we can think of different points of entry into understanding these colonial logics, right? And so my point of entry into it is race. And then we can think about how race is, and the construction of race is gendered and sexualized and kind of heteronormative and all of these other things. But someone's point of entry into it might be queerness, right? And then they think about queerness in conjunction with race and gender and all of these other colonial logics. And so I think the question becomes like, what point of entry you want to take in understanding these broad colonial logics, and how you then think about the ways that all of these categories are co-naturalized with one another, right? And are part of the same onto-epistemological foundation of constructing who's human and who's not human. And so, yes, so that's my answer to that.
Yeah, so it boils down to the colonial logic, which hinges on the genre of the human, as you mentioned.
Right, which is already racialized, gendered, abled, and all of these other things.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Before we let you go, I'd just like to ask our student host to say something, and also I ask the audience to click the like and also to subscribe and press the bell of our channel. We already have more than 1,000 subscribers, so we just want to have more people to be accessing all these very important ideas. So starting from Pedro.
So thank you so much, Dr. Flores, for coming and talking to us. I think that what I'm taking, answering the question that you asked us, what am I going to do tomorrow with everything that I learned here today? I think it's touching with my research is really helping students interrogate the boundaries and the structures that are preventing them from fully developing, from accessing whatever they want. So I think that this is, and there are some other things that touch me in a more personal level, because I'm from Brazil and I had all my blackness erased during my upbringing. So the work of Dr. Anya is also very relevant to me. Whenever I read that, I sometimes cry because it touches me very much in a personal level. So thank you so much for that. We'll probably have to have another day for so many questions.
Exactly. Phoebe?
You should definitely have Anya come if she's available, if she hasn't come yet. She's great.
Yeah.
Yes, we should have Anya come here. Phoebe?
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Nelson, for sharing with us. As Asian teachers, I think what I would like to give thanks to today is we want more Asian teachers to develop awareness as well in the process of assessing their students and also design curriculum resources. So I think your recent articles give us some room for reflecting on what we are doing, especially in Hong Kong as a post-colonial city, or under a lot of stress to push our children to be proficient in a particular way, or language expressions, language proficiency. I think your work will be very impressive to us as well. Even you discuss a lot of examples in the United States and other aspects of the world. Thank you so much today. Thank you, Nelson.
Thank you.
Thank you. Qinghua?
Thank you very much, Dr. Nelson Flores. I really enjoyed your talk, and besides all the good words other students have said, I would like to say that I'm also inspired by the way that you are so passionate and enthusiastic about your work, and also that including how you have done a very passionate presentation on our channel just now. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson. 1,000 thanks. Okay, and I know it's so late at your time. Okay, so and thanks to our audience on YouTube and our student hosts here. Until next time. Okay, so be sure to subscribe and get all the notifications of the next seminar. Okay, thanks again, Nelson. Bye.
Bye.